You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Tony Jordan, president of the Parking Reform Network at the Mpact Transit Plus Mobility Conference in Portland. We talk about getting rid of our cars, the arbitrary requirements for parking around the country, and Donald Shoup's legacy. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, stupendous Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city aficionados and transportation savants, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month could get you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you just want to give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get a podcast feed with 0 outside ads or podcasts. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it. We've also got some bonus material up there, and we'll be posting more soon, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight knit bike scarf is back in stock, and of course, it's getting cold out, so you need one. For you, for your friends, your colleagues, or for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you want to support the show in other ways, you can buy books from the authors we've chatted with on the podcast at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, or you can just keep listening and enjoy the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect. Usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. Tony Jordan, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I live in Portland, Oregon. I've lived here for about 22 years. I have 2 kids. I haven't had a car since 2008, and I am obsessed with parking policy.
Nice. So what made you get rid of your car in 2008?
It started to break. I had a 2000 Ford Focus. I had a 2-year-old, and we were living close in Portland in a neighborhood called Ladd's Addition, and check engine light went on. And so I took it in, and they told me it was going to be the transmission. It's going to cost $2,000. And then they called me and said, nah, it's not the transmission. So you're not going to have to pay for that, but we need you to put a computer chip in here and ride around for a couple of days. And then they said, we think it's the computer. That will cost $2,000. And I said, okay. And then they said, no, actually, it's not the computer. You don't have to pay for that. We think it's an engine rebuild, $2,000. And I said, wait, now I was just going to spend $2,000 on the transmission. No questions asked. If I pay $2,000 for the engine rebuild, the transmission is going to go out. So I said, I'm going to put the car in the garage for 6 months, and we're going to use Zipcar and take the bus and see if it works. And so we did that, and then sold the car for $2,000 6 months later, and really never looked back. I used Zipcar for a while pretty heavily, but I haven't driven probably in 3 years now.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And I have a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old.
No zip cars, no nothing.
I've been in cars, certainly, but I have not driven a car probably in 2 to 3 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Your experience mirrors mine to a certain extent. I sold my car in, I believe, about 2010. And it's actually a funny story. And I don't think I've ever told this on the podcast, but they told me the same thing. They're like, it's your transmission. And I could feel it. I had a stick shift. So I was like, okay, first gear is not working quite right. I have to go to second to start. And it's kind of tough. And so they were like, oh yeah, $2,000. Exactly the same. And I was like, I think I looked up the value of the car, and it's like $2,000 as well. And I was like, I just... this is right after, I think Uber started too, and I had Zipcar, and I had my bike, and I had San Francisco Transit. And so I decided to sell it. But the funny part about selling it was I put it on Craigslist, and this guy from Denver messages me. I had a 1999 Volkswagen Jetta, and this guy from Denver messages me, and he says, I want to buy your car. And I was like, okay, but you're in Denver. And he's like, it's okay. So he flies from Denver to Oakland, takes Bart over to my place, and I'm like, you want to test drive? He's like, yeah, sure. And I was like, well, it's kind of hilly. First gear doesn't work. I said that in the ad too. He's like, it's okay. And so I was like, fine. And so he drove it around for about 5-10 minutes, and he's like, okay, this is great. And I was like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, $2,000. And he's like, okay. He hands over a wad of cash, $2,000. And I was like, all right, it's yours. So I went and did the title thing and all that stuff. And then fast forward a number of years later, and I just like, okay, bye-bye car. A number of years later, and I find the title transfer in like my folder or something. I'm throwing out files. And so I'm like, oh, I see the guy's name. And I just like, oh, I'll Google this guy's name. Well, it turns out he got like the same year, and probably using my car, he got in trouble for siphoning water off of somebody's property in Humboldt County to grow weed. So he got thrown in jail, this guy, after he bought my car. And I guess the reason why he went to Oakland was because they're a little bit more lenient about their weed policy as well. So my car ended up being I guess a drug mule of some sort.
I don't know where my car went. I sold it back to the dealership. Then I figured I was $4,000 up, and that changed how I thought about getting around. And I raised 2 kids with no car, and I don't miss it. I try to drive as little as possible.
What does your partner and your kids say? Like how they feel about this?
My wife didn't really like driving that much, and was totally down for the experiment. My son was only 2, so he had nothing to say about it. I think now my son does have a driver's license, but I think he gets it. He's frustrated with bad transit service and other options, but also he understands that driving is kind of crazy. Yeah. Like, when he took his driver's test, he's like, it's kind of crazy that people can do this. They drive around. And my daughter, it's a little different because she's a young woman and she has more personal safety concerns, which are starting to come up now where she's doing more things at night and people might leer at her or people are following her around. And so that is a different thing. And I think we think about threat vectors, and what's threatening us. And I always just try to say, like, I understand this. And of course, I'm concerned for your safety, but driving everywhere is not the solution to that, right? That's endangering a bunch of other people and still yourself. So like, it's not really on the table for us to be doing that. So I think there's some frustration, but my kids are extremely independent. And I think that helps. They teach other classmates how to take the bus. And I encourage anyone to try to raise their kids without driving them around. It saves you a lot of time too, for sure.
Yeah. We try really hard not to grab a car, but we have to do it every once in a while, like to go to my parents or something along those lines. But for the most part, we're on the bus. And my daughter really loves it. She's like, we're taking Muni. Usually it means we're going to a playground or something. So she's like super excited to take the J or take the bus. I want to know what got you interested in this in the first place. Like, what started this off? Was it when you were a little kid? Was it when you were older? Like, what was the impetus for being interested in cities and transportation? But then, and then parking.
I mean, I kind of wasn't. I mean, I grew up in a SimCity generation. I played SimCity 2000, but I didn't actually think about cities. I grew up in San Pedro, California, at the Port of LA, which is a cool place, but it's also pretty far from downtown LA. And I went to school in Santa Cruz. I left LA because I felt kind of isolated. Like I was, I didn't get my driver's license until I was 19. So I didn't drive around at all as a teen. I don't think I really knew about cities that much. I wasn't really onto it till I moved to Portland in 2002. And then within the few years, you start to kind of walk a bit more, understand a bit more, and really, getting rid of my car in 2008 kind of set me along the path. But ultimately, it was a blog post on a website called Metafilter, old school internet.
Yeah.
The post was called The High Cost of Free Parking. And it was just some links about Donald Shoup's work. I don't even know if it linked to his book. But I looked into it. I clicked on it. I'm a curious person. And I had my wife. It was only a hardcover book at the time. So it was a little harder to get. She got it from interlibrary loan through the university. And I started reading it. And that really, it really was, I read the whole thing. I started talking about it. I would never stop. I'd never shut up. It's like really just like, I was so, Don Shoup asked me one time, like, what did you think when you read the book? And I said, well, I felt like I was kind of like reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and eating a hamburger. Like I look around, we're just a couple blocks from a building I used to work in, the Fox Tower here in Portland, overlooks the city-owned parking garage. I live across the street from a parking lot for a bar. And none of that ever registered to me. And then I read this book and all of a sudden it was like, wow, like why, how, why doesn't anyone know? And that really kicked me off into learning a lot more about urbanism and cities. But it really just started with kind of having my eyes open to how much parking there is and really seeing it for the cost and the space that it takes up and understanding like self-inflicted. It wasn't like a natural thing. We did this to ourselves.
Yeah. It's a glass shattering moment. it's one of those things where you see something for the first time and you didn't realize it happened. Like, for example, in my neighborhood, before I had a kid, I know that they called it Stroller Valley in San Francisco, but I didn't understand that like there were so many kids there. And so after I have a kid, I see the kids now, like they're visible to me more than they were before. And so I feel like that's kind of the same thing. You see the parking and the infrastructure that we built for it everywhere once you kind of get Shoup pilled.
Right. And I think definitely not having a car is double insulting because you're seeing the damage it's done to the city, but then you're like, I'm paying for all this too, and I'm not using it. And so I think that helps too. You're definitely more fertile ground for getting Shoup pilled if you're not a regular driver, because I think just the injustice of, man, I'm unwillingly supporting this and I don't really have a choice makes it even tougher.
Yeah. I do want to ask you like kind of the basics of it, because I know that most of our listeners are probably familiar with the ills of parking, but there are probably a few out there who are newcomers or maybe listening for the first time. So I kind of want to get into like the reasons why parking is kind of a tough subject, a tough animal to crack in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that if you ask an average person, what's the parking problem? They're going to tell you there's not enough parking and it costs too much. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's almost entirely the opposite. There are a few places in the United States that have actually not that much parking, and they're the best places. It's hard to find parking in great places, as the Better Block t-shirt says. Like those are the places that people like to be. And then everywhere else is like a wash in this parking. And even those places where parking is actually congested, it's underpriced and undermanaged. And we got here, I don't even know if it was nefarious. Professor Shoup used to say, like, I think in his book, if you asked Henry Ford to design like the perfect way to sell these cars, you would do what we did with parking minimums. But I think it was more just, we started building freeways, cars started coming into communities. The local business folks and politicians started kind of freaking out, and they said, okay, in our downtowns, maybe we're going to build a parking garage or two or a parking lot, but everywhere else, we're going to solve this problem by just requiring that if you build a house or you start a business or you change a building into a new business, you're going to have to put a certain number of off-street parking spaces, minimum parking requirements or parking mandates. And they started setting these in the zoning code, and they were probably based on local observation or depending on what planner showed up that you hired, but they're arbitrary. We have these arbitrary requirements all across the country. It really stands out when you look regionally at them. I did a survey of parking requirements near the capital of Connecticut, just the region there. And my favorite examples is bowling alleys. You'll find one city has 2 parking spaces per lane. One city has 8 per lane. And literally in this region, I found 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in between, right? You will find a spread for these land uses. And so it really shows they're arbitrary. And anyone who's worked in zoning in advocacy knows it's really hard to change zoning code. It's complicated. It's also very political, especially with parking. So these kind of stagnated. And the impact of that is that every one of these parking spaces we require, you want to build an apartment, you need 1.5 to 2 parking spaces. Okay. If that's a surface lot, it takes up space, 300 to 400 square feet that you could be putting more building on. If you say, oh, well, let's put it, in a parking structure, those parking structures nowadays, a space costs $40,000, $50,000. You want to put it underground, it's going to make 50% or 100% more of that cost. And a $40,000 parking space adds $400 a month to the rent. You add all this together and it's kind of like, wow, we really screwed up. Just go to Google Maps and look at a place that was built before 1950 and a place that was built after 1950, especially commercial development. And you see what happened. I don't think it had to happen that way, but I think especially for shopping centers, like if your city has a code that says a pet store has a different parking requirement than a furniture store, and you want to be able to lease a building to a pet store or a furniture store, you need to have enough parking that you can cover either of those. Otherwise you can't. And we have shopping centers around the country right now that were built after the war that still, I've talked to shopping center owners that have empty storefronts that they can't lease because the city says, no, if you put a restaurant in there, it doesn't work with your mix. So I think that's like when I got into this, I started talking to people and they were like, parking. I'm like, no, you don't know. Like this is it's totally crazy. And I think that it actually is really accessible. It's really easy if you understand how much it costs, how much space it takes up, and how stupid the rules are. And they just show, just look at an overhead map. Why can you fit all of downtown Fayetteville in a space that is in a parking lot 2 miles away, right? Like I just show those. I'm like, you could fit this whole downtown in the Olive Garden parking lot. And you have 2 restaurants that take up the same space as a downtown with 40 restaurants. And I'll joke, Cheesecake Factory's got a big menu, but it can't compete with a whole city's downtown options of menus, So it's a lot of this is a choice. Can we provide more choices?
But one parking space per menu item.
I haven't seen that yet, but
seems like
I'm constantly surprised. Like I found karaoke parking requirements in Los Angeles. Never seen that before. I'm always finding something brand new when in the zoning code.
Zoning codes are wild. I mean, they're arbitrary and ridiculous. And you think about some of the stupid stuff that comes out of the parking requirements, like bars, for example. You don't want people driving home from a bar, but you require, 2 spaces per every 500 square feet for a bar. Those are the types of things where we're negatively impacting public health just from a drunk driving perspective in that instance, but in many other ways as well.
Yeah. And I think like one thing too, I would say around that, because the bar ones, it's a common question. People say, well, this seems like a no-brainer. And the other thing I think people may not know about parking requirements is they're kind of just a backdoor excuse for the city to stop anything from being built that they don't want. Bar parking requirements are pretty high. They're usually around 1 parking space for every 50 or 100 square feet. So you're looking at a parking lot that's going to be 3 to 8 times bigger than the building. And what they do is they prevent a bunch of bars from being able to go in a row, right? You can't put 4 bars in a row. You can't create a bar hopping scene. There's just not enough space. So you can open a new bar at the edge of the city with a big parking lot, or you can find a place in a storefront in the downtown and you can apply for a variance to open a bar. And this allows the city to kind of have an acceptable but arbitrary reason to deny, and I think can lead to corruption, right? Someone has to ask someone for a favor, but it also, in the case of housing or other businesses, it does provide a way to prevent housing or things from being built. So it's kind of just like this arbitrary fake zoning excuse that can be used for almost anything, particularly the bars. Like land uses that are less desirable sometimes seem like they have a higher parking requirement. And that's, I think, so that they can't be concentrated. It's like a backwards way of doing it.
So you got rid of your car. You read Donald Shoup. What starts the parking reform network?
Well, I read the Shoup book. Portland had gotten rid of parking requirements in 2002 on transit corridors in downtown. So actually, the first thing I did after I read Shoup's book was I looked at the zoning code and it was like, oh, Portland was pretty much ahead of the game. We had pretty good policy. So I was kind of disappointed. There wasn't really anything to super go agitate about. But then 2 years later, they started building a bunch of apartments with no parking on a street called Division Street here. And the neighbors freaked out. And then the city started proposing that they were going to add parking mandates back. And so I was like, I read this book. I had worked as a union organizer in the past. So I went down to Planning Commission. I testified. I saw some other people who were in support of what I thought, not adding parking requirements, but they were not organized. They didn't have a mailing list. They were just a couple people, random folks. And so I set up a mailing list and organized testimony, and we lost. The city added parking mandates back. So then they appointed me to some committees, and I was on the committees. And then about 2015, 2016, I said, we need an organization. I started this thing called Portlanders for Parking Reform. And I just had a blog. I would keep track of parking and I would turn people out to testimony. And I started building inroads along with groups like Bike Loud, one of our bike groups. I started working with the YIMBYs. I went to the first YIMBY conference. And so after a couple of years, we got Portland and the state of Oregon kind of back on track. And I said, I think we need to replicate these skills, these lessons, and build a community to advance this movement, to make a movement. There was no movement. There was no parking reform movement. I looked into it and had an opportunity to start a nonprofit to do just that. And really what we are as a community at the core of people who get turned on to this issue, so we can share stories and provide support. And then we can track the success and work on messaging and kind of just make it a more social, fun experience. I think the part of the thing was parking still does have this kind of, oh, that's nerdy or that's boring. And it's not. And the people who get into it are not boring. They're super fun. We just had a happy hour last night that was great.
Yeah.
Great conversations.
It was fun.
A lot of parking, not all parking. So that was kind of I just saw there was a need. And also the YIMBY movement had started and was going great, making a lot of progress on ending parking mandates or reducing them for residences. But they are not focused on the commercial parking requirements, which are also damaging. And there's no constituency really organizing around that. And then there's the whole idea of on-street parking, meters and permits. And the housing groups are starting to get into that, but they weren't really, that's not their forte. That's more like maybe something a bicycle advocacy group or a transit advocacy group might be into. And so I felt like there really needed to be like a holistic place where because these policies, removing your mandates, charging for on-street parking, and then there's another one, which is reinvesting revenue into your local community from parking, they all work synergistically together. And so I think you need a coordinated effort to talk about all three of those things as important at the same time.
I think what's the interesting part to me and kind of showed up last night at your party was that it's building this community. And I find that from the YIMBYs and I find that from other folks is like building this community of folks that are interested in it. Now, as I've gotten old, we used to do a Thursday night geography happy hour in San Francisco once a month. And that was really fun. But once I had a kid, it was kind of harder to get to. And so I'm wondering like how you pull in the folks that are super busy and want to be involved, but also have a lot of stuff going on and trying to get them involved in this stuff that it's really, time consuming to go to these, and important, obviously, to go to public meetings and speak. And you have turned this into like your job where you're going around and talking to different cities and places around the country and doing it. And so how do you get the folks involved who may be super interested, but maybe not have the amount of time that they maybe used to have when they were younger?
Great question. I mean, for one, we're a national organization, so we're dispersed. I mean, we have pockets or places where you would expect there's more members, but we're dispersed. So it's hard to do. We don't actually have a great in-person calendar of events currently. We do occasionally around conferences. We launched in March 2020. So,
That's
which was
tough one.
Tough, but also like in a way, I remember even just in January, as a board, we were meeting and my board members were in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and I'm in Portland. So we were doing like, how are we going to get a conference call? Like video call? No one wanted to do it. And so in a way, I think like coming around during the pandemic, it made it necessary to kind of just make it an online asynchronous kind of thing. I had already done a lot of organizing on the site that used to be called Twitter, and that was really helpful. But one of the things we do is we have a newsletter that comes out every week. And it kind of just keeps people up to date of what's going on. We try and keep it pretty positive and celebrate wins. And it's not doom and gloom. And we really invested a lot in webinars. They're not super well attended, but they provide a point for people to come to. And it's also a great way like to have grad students present their research or talk about messaging or build relationships with partner organizations by having them on the webinar or authors. So I think it's more just you can have offerings that people can just keep in touch. We have a Slack, but a lot of people, they are busy. And I think that one of the things around parking policy advocacy is that it's a long slog. It doesn't require actually a ton of attention at any given time. You're kind of just planting seeds, having conversations, putting it out there. And then every now and then there's an opportunity that you got to strike on. And then in those cases, then we convene. If someone's doing a statewide reform, we will try to put them in touch with the people in other states that have done that before. So a lot of it is social, but it's not organized around in-person type events. It's really just connecting people. Oh, you're in a coastal city with high tourist thing. Okay, well, I can connect you to a planner who works in that kind of community. I can connect you to another community that's like that. And then it's those one-to-one connections that's building the network.
What are some of those wins lately that have been really exciting to you?
I mean, we've seen a lot over the last 5 years around cities getting rid of parking mandates. We went from something like 16, 17. The number always changes because we uncover a few here and there that we didn't see before. But now we're up almost to 100 U.S. cities. Baltimore, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, voted to eliminate parking mandates citywide. I think Pittsburgh is coming up soon. So there's been great, exciting citywide reforms. But then the statewide reforms are really exciting. We've seen this last session, Washington State passed a pretty great bill that cities above a certain size, a lot of cities in Washington, restricts them from having parking requirements for things like daycare and adult foster care. Connecticut actually passed a bill that got vetoed, but passed out of both houses that was a bill to eliminate parking requirements for residential requirements, the whole state. Montana passed a bill similar to Washington. 2 years ago, Colorado passed a bill that is based on transit, but it punched enough holes kind of, if you imagine a map of where the city's allowed to have parking requirements, it punched so many holes in that map that the city planners were like, it's not worth it to maintain the map. Let's just get rid of the parking requirements citywide. So Denver and Boulder and other cities in Colorado on the Front Range just are getting rid of their parking requirements. So that's a lot of times the state reforms, even if they're more incremental, they kind of push. I think of it like some people have a cooler in their garage. They haven't opened for a long time. And like you open this up and it's like, oh man, I left some fish in, like something terrible in there. That's when you go look at your zoning code. I think if you can force the city to go look at the zoning code, it's terrible. And so like they might just decide, let's just reform the whole thing rather than trying to fix it. Upcoming, I think this next year is going to continue on the statewide reform. We've heard from several states where they're interested in introducing full repeals. And there's actually a bill in North Carolina that's live that passed unanimously out of its house to eliminate parking requirements in the whole state. And that one is from the river keepers. Catawba river keepers promoted this bill based on conservation of waterways. Parking lots, when it rains, all the water, it either floods your sewer or the sealant and the oil goes out and pollutes it. So this is as we have more heavy rainpour events, due to shifts in how our atmosphere is working, that's a problem. And it's something that I think is actually pretty universal, right? People understand they want to protect their waterways. And we spend a lot of money on sewage. Like here in Portland, we don't have a subway, but we did drill a subway side tunnel that fills with sewage from parking lots every time it rains. And I bet a lot of listeners, if they go look, they've seen that on their water bill. Oh yeah, we drilled the subway tunnel ourselves too that we fill with parking lot stuff every time.
Yeah, the water inflow cost and the water outflow cost, and the outflow is more expensive sometimes.
Exactly.
I'm curious too about your thoughts on like the other side of the equation, the developer side, because you can get rid of parking requirements, but it doesn't say like, oh, you can't build parking. And so sometimes we hear about how the bankers and stuff, they won't let a developer build in a place that parking requirements are gone because it doesn't, quote unquote, pencil for them specifically.
Yeah. I mean, it's good and bad, right? On one hand, you can tell concerned neighbors and city council people, things don't change overnight, right? When Austin got rid of parking requirements, or Baltimore, whenever that goes into effect, right? The city's the same city the next day. It takes a long time to build things. And so I think on one hand, it's kind of okay. One of our arguments is the people in the best shape to decide how much parking is needed for a business or a building are the people who are spending the money on it, either renting it or building it or managing it. You can trust them because they don't want to lose money to kind of know their market. Now, it's not only bankers, right? Some developers want to build parking. Also, brokers and retailers, whether commercial or residential, and even the businesses themselves. I went to a shopping center conference and they have, Dave's Hot Chicken or some other business has its own parking requirement. You can't, you need 40 spaces. You can't open our business in your shopping mall. So I think that's okay. I used to get upset for any parking to be built, and I still a little bit in my core am, but what you're going to get is a few more apartments, right? We know that what's going to happen is that the architect is no longer constrained by the parking. The architect builds the parking first and then builds as much housing as they're allowed to, or as much, whatever the thing you're actually going to, they build as much of that as they can. There are other aesthetic considerations, but they're going to do their architect thing. And if you free them from the constraints of the parking, they're probably going to add a few more units. And those units are going to be very marginally cheap, right? And they also don't have an amenity associated with them. They don't have the parking associated with them. So they're probably going to rent cheaper. People say, oh, how do you know? The landlord's going to charge the same price. And I say, well, if you were renting two apartments in the same building, the exact same apartment, and one had a parking space and one didn't, would you pay the same price? No one would do that. Like, you don't need to study this. It's a logical just fact. So I think over time, the benefit here, regardless of the bankers, is that we'll see more housing built with less parking. And if that is successful, then bankers look at comps. They're going to follow the money. That story I told early from Portland, one developer brought up a banker and convinced them that there were enough people riding bikes on Division Street that they could put an apartment there and it would lease. And then it leased. And then we had a bunch more come in. So once you show it makes money, then the bankers are going to follow. I think the key is remove the impediment, and then the city does have to do work to make it a favorable place. No one's going to go build an apartment with no parking in the middle of nowhere. So the city does have to do work to make it favorable if that's what they're looking for, is to reduce the ownership.
I also want to talk to you about Donald Shoup and his legacy. He's now an urban planning legend, but eventually I think he might get on the Mount Rushmore of planning folks with Jane Jacobs, maybe a few others. What do you think his legacy is, and what do you think he left us?
Man, rest in peace. He was a great guy. I wish I got to know him a lot sooner. A lot of the eulogies around him in the talk after he passed away in February were like how rare it is for an academic to see their work actually take off. I went to a memorial at UCLA a couple weeks ago, and there was a comment of someone who was working with him it might have been in the might have been before the book came out. So early 2000s. And they were like, he was really frustrated apparently. Like I didn't know him then, but he was really frustrated that people weren't listening to him. I'll just, as an aside, he was also really big into like repairing sidewalks, and he was really frustrated up till the day he died. I'm pretty sure that like the city of LA wasn't listening to him about how to fix all these broken sidewalks, so he was the kind of guy that just, he wanted to see it happen. I think the legacy, we're seeing a short-term legacy. We're seeing the widespread acceptance that parking policy, especially around parking mandates, is terrible. And we're seeing that that's getting rolled back. And I'm happy to say I've got a role in that from the organizing side. He laid this groundwork of a pretty solid argument that you can point to. I'll joke sometimes, you can stand on the book literally. And if you're not that tall, it's a thick book. So, it's a great piece to back up your argument. Long term, I think you're right. I think that the impact of Shoup is going to be, assuming that, we're around, is going to be extremely massive. If you think the first parking requirements went in maybe the late 30s, early 40s, and it took about 30, 40 years before there was a pronounced enough problem that Donald Shoup noticed it and started scratching the surface and trying to find out what was wrong. And then it took another 20, 30 years for him to develop enough research and write his book and actually lay it bare. And then it's taken about 20 years for that to actually start leading to on the ground policy change. So that's taken 60, 70, 80 years, depending on how you count it. Now we have to unscrew up our city, and that's going to take a long time. If you think about when my children are my age or older, or a child born today, if they're growing up in a community that actually is walkable, and if they have abundant, affordable housing and things to do, that's going to be because of Don Shoup. Other people too, but it wouldn't get there without that. So I think his true impact is really, if we keep doing our work now, going to be coming down the line. And I think, yeah, definitely it's massive. The best is yet to come still. Granted, acknowledging all the other things going on.
We'll put a pin in that
Just want to acknowledge
put
it.
Put a pin in that one. Well, you also recently contributed to the Shoup Doctrine, which is a series of essays celebrating Donald and his work, edited by Daniel Baldwin Hess. It was finished before his passing, did he get to read it? Do you know if he got to look at it and stuff?
He edited almost every chapter. In fact, the last email I have from him was just a week or two before he fell ill. I was asking him some question I don't know, but he wrote back and said, by the way, thanks so much for writing the chapter in the book. I had the pleasure of editing, 30 eulogies of myself before I died. And he did have kind of a dark sense of humor. One time he told me I was going to an event in Florida that he was at. He was receiving the Seaside Prize, and I got delayed due to a freak snowstorm. And he said, I understand. Every trip I take, I hope it's my last. And I was like, don't say that. But he kind of, I think, he got to read it, and he loved to edit. Apparently I learned that, and he got to read all these stories. I mean, what a way to go up till the end, just seeing the impact that you've had on, we're just a 30-person representative sample. Multiply that by 10 of people who he's probably significantly impacted their lives at least. And he taught thousands of students at UCLA. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And I was reading Bill Fulton's post after his funeral, and I thought this line specifically was very important. I wanted to read it to you and get your response, but it says, in the end, he wasn't really about parking. Don was an economist, and his mission was to help people understand the underlying economics of public goods and services. Parking was simply the vehicle, one might say, that he chose to do so.
I could see that. I mean, I do think Don found parking itself extremely hilarious. I mean, I think the on-street, certainly the economics is clearly how we manage parking versus almost anything else in this country is the most socialist, crazy thing we do.
Right.
But I think also he was a funny guy. And I think parking mandates are crazy. And so I think just the absurdity of the situation cracks me up, and I know cracked him up. As upsetting as it is, it's also just when you see things like a haunted house parking requirement in Gilbert, Arizona for 1 per 100 square feet. And then in Carver, Massachusetts, there's a cemetery requirement, 1 for 8 occupants. What is that even? It's a never ending supply of jokes and ridiculous stories, the absurdity. So I think
that
he
sounds
was
like a good Halloween blog post too.
Yeah. There's a lot of spooky ones, Yeah. They're scary stuff, these parking requirements.
Totally scary. Totally scary. I also want to ask, you've been through the literature, you've gone through all the blog posts, and you've seen all the news come through. I'm wondering where the strangest place is that you've heard a reference to either Donald Shoup or the high cost of free parking.
Oh man, that's a tough one. That might be hard for me because I'm so in the scene that everything just seems related. I mean, actually, I got it. Okay. Now, I don't know if this is direct reference, but what's that show about the people who are fighting in Los Angeles? It's Ali Wong, I think. The opening episode is this woman cuts someone off in a parking lot. And then, Beef. They have their incident in the parking lot and they're chasing each other down the road. And then, it's very clear the street, I think, where they run over some plants and have all this thing, it's Shoup Avenue. And I don't know. I would love to know. I feel like that's like a reference. The show starts in a parking lot and then they have a shot where Shoup Avenue is in the background. I'm going to say that. I think there was an Easter egg. Maybe someone will hear this and confirm or deny it. But if it's not intentional, there's definitely a Shoup Easter egg in Beef. You know what?
The producer saw him on Adam Conover's show, right? He saw the cartoon of Shoup.
Probably, yeah. You know, I mean, more and more people know what's going on with the guy. So I think that's my pick for that.
That's awesome. Something a little bit different. I feel like that we don't talk about enough. You probably talk about this a little bit, but I feel like we don't talk about enough is from an environmental perspective is like the heat island effect in parking spaces. And something that we see all the time, at least I do combing through news every day, is there's a discussion almost every day about global cities and how heat is going to impact them eventually. And so here in the United States, I feel like because of all the parking that we've built, because of all these lots that are the size of Fayetteville, Arkansas, the heat island effects are devastating. And there's parts in the summer in Phoenix where you can't even walk on the sidewalk without like burning yourself. And so I'm wondering if you've seen a lot of discussion about that recently, where it's not just the transportation aspect or the housing aspect, but the environmental aspect as it pertains to global warming, the heat effect. You had a heat dome here in Portland like a couple of years ago that was crazy hot, those types of things.
I think awareness, I mean, obviously the political climate is kind of dampening some of this, but I think that there is more awareness. There's articles coming out regularly, not only like the asphalt, but the color of cars parked in these lots. Yeah. I think that it is a hidden cost. We did a literature review a while back of studies that talk about flooding or urban heat island effects. And one interesting thing is that a lot of the academic research talks about paved surfaces. It has this kind of like euphemistic, paved surfaces. And I think one thing we need to do and I think that the researchers need to start calling this out for what it is. These are government mandated parking lots, right? I mean, sure, roads are paved surfaces and they contribute, but they have an extreme utility that we aren't, I know my food came here on a truck, so, but we don't need to require all these parking lots. And so that's a negative. We did a bunch of parking lot maps. If you've seen on our website, guy Thomas Carpenito did these maps of a bunch of downtowns. And researchers have taken those overlays. Several research labs have taken them, and one used them to make a computer vision model to be able to help identify parking lots in a satellite map. So we can do more of this research. And then there's another researcher, Vanderbilt, Lin Meng, who is an environmental ecologist and is looking at using these maps to look at various things, heat issues. I learned from her that parking lots are one of the largest sources of light pollution. And you brought up Arizona. I know there's a Professor David King there who studies parking, and he's really interested in this for the public health aspect around, like, if you get off on a bus on the street, you might die walking across the parking lot in the middle of the summer. If you're a person with fragile health, you might not be able to make it. And I think that these are going to become more aware. And I hope that environmental and public health organizations and funders look at some of this built environment stuff. I do think there is a gap in climate, public health, environmental advocacy and funding around land use and small T transportation, I'll call it, like individual mobility, shared mobility. I was at Climate Week. These aren't things that it's clean tech, it's EV, and it's like, no, we can do some solutions on the ground that are actually just policy switches that don't cost anything. They might even make money for your city. They don't generate a whole new industry, but they actually provide a lot of value. So I don't know. That's a roundabout way of saying I do see it. And I think it's only going to become more apparent.
Yeah, and I feel like, and I've said this a few times on the show, we talk about streets and the spaces in between, and they do serve a function. They get people to where they want to go. They get our goods to where we want to go. They get electricity, water, sewer, communications infrastructure. The street is an interesting kind of mechanism for all those things, but it's also something that, has this problem at the moment where we park all of our cars in it, right? So I'm curious your thoughts on like the value of streets generally as part of that overall system that we live in.
I think, the curb zone. We do a lot of work with a partner in New York City, Open Plans, and they have a whole thing around. First, let's stop calling it the parking lane, right? So the curb lane and the curb zone is, for people who are familiar, like with strong towns or this Urban 3, Joe Minicozy, they'll know, like there's kind of a thought sometimes people say your streets are actually a liability for the city because they cost so much. I mean, they're extremely valuable, but they're unpriced and the city has to maintain them. But the curbs are, in my opinion, like they're a big asset and they're an undervalued asset. There's a lot of things we could be doing them. We saw the pandemic showed us al fresco dining, right? But then we see that being rolled back in a lot of cities. And I think some of that is that, it's hard to value, like in the downtown core, this is the most valuable land on earth. And 200 square feet of it is free. And then next to there, you want to put a restaurant or whatever. And like that should cost something, but it's unfair to charge the person with their business necessarily if the person's storing their car there for free. And we have this kind of like, because parking is so underpriced, it's this weird paradox where it's like both invaluable and valueless. And I think by starting to price it, we can start to actually see and make trade-offs between, okay, well, this should be a pickup and drop-off zone. This should be a bus lane. This should be a bike lane, and also then when you install that infrastructure, if you're using a demand-based pricing scheme for your downtown parking, like if you're something like SF Park or what Seattle does, the adjacent parking spaces will adjust. They'll become a little more valuable. The curb should be about mobility. It's about the interface between how things get to places and how they get into places. And we really can do a lot more, I think, to provide better access and improve transit and raise funding for transit and other mobility. And another big one is, obviously we know local freight, right? That's a big kind of thing. No one please charge me a couple bucks every time that delivery truck comes to my house. Like I would love to pay, I would love to pay that money and have it go towards something that helps remove those vehicles from the street so often and helps make things better. So I think, the curb is kind of the next frontier on, I think, parking reform, helping cities or providing what's the playbook? How do we get the flywheel going on street management the same way we have for parking minimum reforms? And we're working hard to try and figure that out.
Going back to like the comment about Donald Shoup being an economist, I feel like that's part of this discussion, right? The economy of the curb, because there is so much that happens at the curb, especially with this delivery system revolution that we've had. It's also interesting to think about all these warehouses that have been popping up in cities. Like warehousing used to be, we the Pearl District and everything else would get changed because warehousing and urban industry wasn't a thing anymore. But now it is again because all of these companies like Amazon and UPS and everybody else, now they need places in the city that are warehouses, that are places that were probably formerly industrial, because they have this massive delivery, mandate from their customers. And it's interesting to see like that shift again, going back in time to places that need this. And now, not just that, the urban industrial areas, but the streets that they use, right? The streets that they use to deliver all these things. And there's value in that. And how to extract that value is interesting. And where we use that value eventually is interesting too. And so from your perspective, there's a discussion about when we do price parking, where do we use the money that gets raised from that? But also, if you're talking about delivery systems, like if you are charging somebody $1 per parcel to deliver something, where does that money go?
Right. Well, so for parking, you want to spend it locally. So the initial parking benefit district is what this term Donald Shoup came up with. You want to spend it locally, and that has a couple benefits. One, it's fair. The people who they're taking the burden of that traffic in their community and you're reinvesting, and it also helps buy political will from them. You're improving their neighborhood by charging for parking. The money's not going into a black hole. It's also really good because cities get hooked on parking revenue. And let's say you have a plan, a bike pedestrian plan or a mode shift plan that's supposed to reduce the number of drive trips, but you're also funding a good chunk of your discretionary operations at your transportation department or your city from parking revenue. Well, what's going to win? Are we really going to try and remove the parking spaces or discourage people from driving downtown? Because we know that's going to hurt our bottom line. So doing this kind of local investment, it helps to make it so that the city is not as hooked on the parking revenue. For the delivery, and this is a little outside of the parking sphere, but I think we need more logistics. It ties back also to people who are car light or car free. we need networks in our cities. This is my pitch, is that we need networks in our cities to help move stuff around that's not by a conglomerate, not Amazon or FedEx. And I think that if I was in charge and I was assessing a fee for every delivery, I would invest that first in local hubs for package pickup. So the idea is you don't want the truck driving down every street. If you want to drive to your house, you pay a couple extra bucks. Otherwise, it gets dropped off at this facility that the city ideally runs. And then maybe you pay a neighbor kid to take a cargo bike and go pick up everyone's packages, like an old paper delivery person, like, I don't know, could create some economy for people, some smaller electric vehicles. But also those hubs I envision could serve as a way for selfishly, like if I come downtown here to Portland and I buy something big, I don't have a car and it's hard for me to get it back home. And I would love to have, I think if we really want people to reduce their dependency on automobile, we do need to solve this problem around moving stuff. And I think there's a opportunity here to like come up with a solution of some sort of circulator where I can drop something at one of these facilities downtown. And depending on how fast I need it, pay to have it show up at the facility across town and go get it. And that would be a great, I think, public service that would not only support going car free, but would support local business too. How can local businesses compete with the logistical prowess of Amazon.com? Well, I think this is one way maybe they can. If you have a system of cheap local logistics, maybe that's a thing. It's a little off the topic, but it's something I think about a lot. And I think that it solves some of these problems, because when you're trying to get people to accept that an apartment can be built with no parking spaces, they're like, well, what about when they need to buy a sofa? What about when they need to, bring a bunch of groceries home? And so I think that attacking some of those legitimate arguments that I understand, I don't have a car. It sucks sometimes. If you can solve that problem for me, then you can convince a lot of other people that maybe they don't need the second car anymore. Maybe they don't need a car at all.
I was just in China visiting my wife's parents. In their neighborhood, they have, 4 or 5 or 6 high rises, and there's probably 30 stories tall. And in order to get your Taobao or whatever you ordered, you have to go to this center that's run by this couple. And it's basically a storefront. They take all the packages in and organize them. And then you come and you put your phone in the thing, and then they give you your package. And I feel like that's the kind of thing you're talking about, which is like Amazon, I guess, does it with an Amazon locker, but a more local way is like having this couple, be the package delivery takers every day. And so you don't have to be home to take it. You just have to go in the next 24 hours or else they yell at you.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the difference between that, once again, is Amazon lockers are for Amazon.
Right.
And I think this comes to parking, it comes to a lot of things. The privatization of public space or public spaces is a problem here. The single use, we need more shared mobility, more shared things in general. I think at least in the places where we want to live compactly, environmentally friendly, active lifestyles, you need these places. I mean, I was in New York recently and I was using Bounce. I mean, there are apps to help facilitate this, but it would be nice if it was a little more formalized, where this was just a thing we did, where it's easy to get a package here or there. And I think we will move towards that. It would be super helpful if our cities could unlock some funding sources that could help support these things. Because I think sometimes these types of services, bike share, car share, this kind of logistical thing, they're hard to, especially to start up. They don't make a lot of money, and they shouldn't necessarily make a lot of money. Bike share shouldn't be a giant profit center. Transit. So I think that these public goods do need subsidy, and having, this source of money in the curb is a great way to try to improve some of these services or potential services.
I agree with you, but I also think that there's an opportunity to create value so that they are quote unquote profitable, but not from like the monetary standpoint, but from the value to the community standpoint, right? So we have to rethink the way that we think about profit, and we think about running cities like a business, quote unquote. I had Daniel Wartell London on the show, and he wrote a book about New York City and the different times where they could have been more progressive, or, Henry George could have been the mayor of New York City, and they could have changed so that the developers weren't the ones that were making the money off the development, and then we were taxing them. But maybe the city is being the developer, and they're the ones that are making the money, and then distributing that to the population in a different way. And so I think that discussion, if we start to think about it differently in the value that cities create for their residents, I think there's a way that the package delivery thing could be profitable for a city to do, but profitable in the sense that, yeah, you might make a little money, but you're also creating more value for your citizens in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, to go back to my example of how I haven't driven in 3 years, I think one of the problems with car share service, shared vehicles, is it works too well. Once you start paying per trip, you figure out other ways to do things.
Right.
You might start out as a Zipcar or an Uber user that's doing it, X times a week. But unless like you are absolutely extremely wealthy, you're probably going to start chipping away at those trips that you're taking. Then you start to change your behavior. And I don't want to force anyone to do anything. I think that just the option, the avenue to understanding that this life is possible and actually is generally, other than the annoyances, it's great not driving, but I think that that's why when I talk about like it needs some subsidy, because I think that some of these services, maybe not the package delivery example, but they're harder to keep going. And you do need a base that, supports it. It needs good investment in infrastructure. I love bike share, but if you take a bike somewhere and then you can't count on there being a bike to come back from that neighborhood, you're not going to take it. And that's kind of what happened here in Portland. I stopped using the bike share because if I could find a bike in my neighborhood, I was pretty sure there wasn't going to be one for me to come back with. And so I just got my own e-bike, and I would rather not own my own e-bike.
Yeah.
It's a digression here. But
Where can folks find out more about the Parking Reform Network?
We have a website, parkingreform.org. We have a presence on most social media, whether it's monitored or active, pretty active on Instagram, Blue Sky. We have an account there. We have a YouTube channel. So I would say online is a great way to look and get on our newsletter. We have a weekly newsletter that people really enjoy. That will tell you where you might find us in person.
And also, we're at the Mpact conference here in Portland. I do have to ask if you're going to be in Toronto next year.
I don't know. This is the first time I've been to Mpact in person.
It's in your backyard, so it's...
Yeah. It was. I've actually never been to Canada. So,
get your passport. Get your passport.
I have it. It's shameful. So I would like, I think
the Canadian Parking Reform Network as well.
Yeah. Toronto has no parking mandates. Ottawa's coming soon. Canada actually has bigger cities that have done the reform than the United States.
Yeah. Well, I'll be there. I'll hope to see you there. Where can folks find you specifically, Tony Jordan, if you wish to be found?
Well, I live in Portland. You can find me. I'm pretty available. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Blue Sky. You can send me an email at tony@parkingreform.org. And I go to conferences, all kinds of them: housing conferences, transportation conferences, shopping center conferences, Climate Week. I'm probably there.
Awesome. Well, Tony, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course. But I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you, and just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody. And yeah, so we'll see you next time.